Hi, Trevor.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, Catherine, and good evening, David. Thank you very much for joining me this evening, everybody. My name is Trevor White. I'm the director of the Little Museum of Dublin. I am deputising for Sarah Costigan, who normally hosts Santa Rita 120 Dublin Stories. I am thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be joined by Catherine de Courcy, who is the author of this wonderful book, Dublin Zoo, An Illustrated History, which Catherine wrote. And I'm also thrilled to be joined by David Blake Knox. Good evening, David. David is the author of this book, which is called The Curious History of Irish Dogs. And I thought it would be fun to have David and Catherine on to talk about the history of animals, given their expertise in this subject. Just by way of preface, I should also acknowledge that my own, I suppose, fascination with this subject was prompted by a previous edition of this program that we did with Juliana Adelman, who wrote this book, which some of you may know, which is called Civilized by Beasts. And that's about animals and urban change in 19th century Dublin. And that was last November. But since then, I've been on a bit of an odyssey. And that's brought me into contact with David and Catherine. So I'm very, very, very grateful to you both for joining us here this evening. Maybe, Catherine, we might start with you, if we may. You might just tell us a little bit about yourself and about the genesis of your book about Dublin Zoo.
Hi, Trevor. Hi, David. It was by lucky chance, I suppose. I left Ireland in 1985 to work in Papua New Guinea. I ended up in Melbourne, and really by way of trying to find a way to communicate and connect in with the local community, I approached University of Melbourne to see if I could do a master's on history. And the same week, by chance, Melbourne Zoo approached the university to see if they had a graduate student who would be prepared to write a history of Melbourne Zoo. And I'd already written 3 books, including one on the early history of the National Gallery of Ireland. And I think they thought I might have been a good match because the National Gallery of Ireland was founded at the same time as Melbourne Zoo. And it started from there. So I was in Melbourne for 15 years. I wrote a number of other books, including several on Australian zoos. And when I came back to Ireland, I went to visit the new baby elephants in 2008 in Dublin, Asha and Budai, which were the 2 first Asian elephants to be born in Dublin Zoo. And the director of Dublin Zoo, Leo Osterwegel, had been the director of Melbourne Zoo, and he knew my work because zoo history is a sort of an obscure area of research. And he invited me to write the history of Dublin Zoo. So that was published in 2009. And I was then invited to update it in 2019, which is the book that's now available. That's the history that's now available in the shops. The 2009 one is now out of print.
I see, thank you. I dare say that many of the people joining us this evening will have their own memories of Dublin Zoo, and I'd urge you please to share them with us in the chat section. And indeed, if you have any questions for David or Catherine, please don't hesitate to ask us in that chat section. I wonder, just for yourself, Catherine, do you have memories as a child of Dublin Zoo? Is it something that you had a close connection to, or was it really through the writing of the book?
No, Dublin Zoo was the zoo of my childhood. So we would have gone periodically. My mum was a member, so we were able to go in for a few hours rather than spend the whole day there. And I would have remembered riding Cummerly the elephant and trying to get the parrot to talk and trying to avoid having a snake put around my neck. And that would have continued on until I was maybe 12 or 13. And then you kind of lose interest or are a bit concerned about what is a zoo. So when I started working on the history of Melbourne Zoo, that would have been my memory. So very happy memories, but also a question mark. And I think that's a really important aspect of writing any history of a zoo, is having that question mark over it.
Okay, great. Thank you. David, you might tell us a little bit about your own book, please, and the genesis of this wonderful history of Irish dogs, which I've spent the afternoon reading.
Well, first of all, I grew up with dogs, so I always kind of connected with them. In fact, they were part of my family. But I wrote an article some years ago about Michael Collins's relationship with the Kerry Blue Terrier. And it appeared in a newspaper, and to my surprise, I got a lot of responses to it. A lot of them quite abusive, I have to say, because I had mentioned in the course of this that he attended a dog show where he was competing against members of the staff of the Viceroy, as it was then in Ireland. And people were saying Michael Collins wouldn't have had the time to look after dogs, and it was frivolous, and but so that encouraged me, if you like, to dig a little deeper into the history, first of all, of the Kerry Blue, and then through that I began to explore the histories of all 9 native breeds that are considered to be native breeds, and I found that all of them had an important social, political, and cultural dimension. A lot of them were involved in political controversies. A lot of them, occupied a very contentious role in Irish society at different times. Some of them were killed for ostensibly political reasons, and some of them, their claims of their status were perhaps not wholly justified.
Yeah, I was very struck by the story of the Kerry Blue Terrier in the book this afternoon, and again that comparison with the Irish Wolfhound, and the way in which they both served as emblems of Irishness. But they represent different traditions, of course, don't they?
It's very different traditions.
You might just tell us. You might just tell us. We'll come back maybe to the Kerry Blue in a little while, but I want you to tell us a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, about this very exotic man, this great spoofer, really, Captain George Augustus Graham.
Well, George Augustus Graham was an Englishman, though he defined himself as Scottish on the basis that his ancestors had come from Scotland, and he liked to dress in full Highland regalia from time to time. But he came from a very wealthy family, and he originally served as an officer in India. When he came back, he bought a large estate in rural Gloucestershire, and he decided that he was going to reconstitute the Irish Wolfhound. It was a dog of legend, but by common account and accurately, it had become extinct in the course of the early 19th century. And the reason for that was very obvious, because the wolfhound had been used to hunt wolves, and wolves had become extinct about 50 years earlier. And so the raison d'etre for the wolfhound diminished, and it had died out. So, but he believed he could reconstitute it, and he devoted 50 years of his life and very considerable both personal and financial resources to reconstituting the breed. One of the things that struck me was that he commissioned a model of his ideal wolfhound, and he posed for photographs with this model, and then he tried to recreate out of a mixture of different dogs, some Russian, some Scottish, some English, and even some Tibetan dogs, what he believed was the model of the original Irish Wolfhound. But one of the significant differences was that the Irish Wolfhound, as it originally existed, was a pretty ferocious beast, because it had to hunt and kill wolves. The dogs that he bred had completely different temperament. They're kind of soppy, big soppy creatures, and but they looked like his idea of a wolfhound, and in time they became accepted as the idea of a wolfhound. They still are. They're still they're still conceived as, but whether we like it or not, what is now regarded as the quintessential Irish dog originated in England in the 1860s.
So I love the way you go through the genealogy of it. So we have Russian. There's a bit of a Borzoi. There's a bit of a Mastiff, I think. And there's a Scottish Deerhound as well. Yeah. But there's no real evidence of any Irish.
Well, he did buy some dogs from Ireland, which he'd been told were. I mean, he advertised in the Irish press and said, he was willing to pay top dollar for an Irish wolfhound. And not surprisingly, some people said they had Irish wolfhounds, which they were prepared to sell for top dollar. But when they arrived, he was disappointed with the ones that came from Ireland, and he didn't feel that they measured up to his pretty, specific requirements. I mean, the other thing I should say, and this is in fairness, if you like, to the dogs that he bred, was that he practiced. I mean, he was very, very determined to succeed, and he employed very, very close inbreeding at times. I mean, he bred dogs and bitches from the same litter. He sometimes bred grandparents with their grandchildren. I mean, he was just driven to do this. He also was very, very well socially connected, and when he established the Irish Wolfhound Society, it was largely composed of a mixture of Irish gentry and English aristocrats, but it got a lot of attention and a lot of support.
And of course, today we have the wolfhound as the emblem of our national theatre.
But you see, I like to think it's become Irish, like it may be adopted, but we have taken Graham's creation. It's essentially a designer dog, which is apparently a new creation, but it is basically a dog he designed and constructed.
But of course, so many of the modern dog breeds that we know of are really a Victorian invention.
Yeah, they were certainly refined in Victorian England, and in fact, the few that weren't refined, such as the Glenavermell Terrier, were sometimes referred to as antique dogs because they hadn't been remodeled essentially. And some remodeling was necessary in some cases because you were taking dogs out of a context in which they had been bred to hunt or to or to kill vermin or whatever, and you're putting them in an urban centre where there was much less opportunity and need for them to do that. So they did actually need some reconstruction if they were to survive at all.
I just wonder, Catherine, listening to the zeal of this Captain George Augustus Graham, whether you're reminded in a way of the sort of the passion of the founders of Dublin Zoo, because of course it was very much a labor of love as well in the early days by people who were doing it really with a tremendous sense of purpose and mission. And I wonder whether you might just reflect for a little bit on the genesis of the zoo, and particularly in the context of the kind of the international movements at that time.
Yeah, but I have to say though, listening to David, I'm reminded a bit about the Irish lion industry into the 19th and early 20th century, where Dublin perfected the art of breeding the lion. They went all over the world, and they were considered very strong and very healthy, but I think there was a certain amount of inbreeding going on. They were also fed whiskey and potatoes, but they were known as strong, hardy lion cubs that would travel easily to Australia, to America, and so on. But yeah, it is that enthusiasm that's extraordinary. Because when you think that the Dublin Zoo was founded by the Zoological Society in 1830 and opened in 1831 in Phoenix Park, which was just outside Dublin. So they would have been going out there. These people who were surgeons, physicians, there was an architect, businessmen, would have gone out, I presume, by horse, and would have been out in all weathers directing what to do with the porcupine or what to do with the boar or what to do with the monkeys that somebody had presented. and they'd come out about twice a week. Now they'd have a big breakfast. That was a tradition. The council members having a big breakfast was a tradition that continued right until the 1980s. But you can understand why, because they were actually running the zoo. And their drive was education, was primarily education. It was to sensitize people towards animals, because in the 1830s, there was a huge move towards trying to ban blood sports. And the blood sports that were banned were the ones that could get through the House of Lords, which were the ones that the working classes and the general public were involved with. So bear baiting and so on. And what Philip Crampton, who was a leading member of the foundation party, the foundation team, wanted was to sensitize people so that they would learn to appreciate the animals and would therefore learn not to hurt them or harm them. Right. And it's a very interesting, it's often overlooked, because Dublin Zoo was the fourth zoo in the modern tradition that's still going strong. So London was the third, and then Vienna and Paris were the first and second. And one of the things I found quite interesting was looking at Melbourne Zoo history, which I didn't discover till I was doing the Dublin Zoo history, was that quite a few of the founders of Melbourne Zoo had been members of the Dublin Zoo Society. And they must have emigrated in the 1840s and decided that this was a good thing to create in the new city of Melbourne in the 1850s. So on the one hand, there was very little communication between zoos. On the other hand, they were picking up ideas from each other. And that continues to this day, because zoos lead other zoos. Their ideas evolve, and they look to each other for ideas. And even to this day, Dublin Zoo is a charity, and there's a council who go out and meet in all weathers across the traffic once a month to guide the zoo and to oversee what's happening in the zoo. So it's an extraordinary commitment of time by these people.
It's fascinating to think of its footprint extending to the other side of the world. I had no idea that we had that influence in Melbourne. It's lovely to think of that. I wonder whether you just tell us a little bit specifically about that relationship with London Zoo, and then the decision that we take on the Sunday decision, maybe in terms of going a different path.
Yeah, I think this is a key moment in the history of Dublin Zoo. London Zoo was founded as a society zoo in 1826, and Nicholas Vickers, an Irishman, was involved. So was Stamford Raffles. And it was a combination of science and colonialism. And they had access to a lot of money. The zoo opened in 1828 and was incredibly popular. And then they suggested that they helped Dublin set up the zoo. But London Zoo was only open to society members and their friends. And in 1847, nearly 20 years after it first opened, they allowed the public in on certain days. But they weren't allowed in on a Sunday until the Second World War. So it remained a society zoo until the 1940s. Dublin started out as a society zoo, but allowing people in for the fee of sixpence, which would have been expensive. But there were several social people. They were actually from a Quaker background, and they were into social justice very deliberately, and they believed that the general public should be allowed access to Dublin Zoo. Now, in all honesty, the general public had access by going around the lake when it was shallow at the far end, or slipping into the fence on a Sunday morning or something. But they allowed the public in for a penny on a Sunday from 1840. And I believe this is one of the things that makes Dublin Zoo special, because it's always been about visitors. It's always been about the people who visit the zoo, about the visitors and the animals and the keepers. And it's definitely something, when I look at zoos around the world, that stands out.
There was a precedent, of course, I think, wasn't there, on the Queen Victoria's coronation, was it, that is it 1837 or 38, they decided to open the doors for free, and allegedly, is it 20,000 people descend on the 4-acre site?
Allegedly 20,000. To this day, I mean, a busy day in Dublin Zoo now with the main section and the African plains would be 14,000, and that would be heaving.
Right.
Have 20,000 on 4 acres. I mean, they must have been all around the lake. They must have been in the lake.
Yes.
Where they went, heaven only knows. And there weren't that many animals, but that's the story.
Print the legend. David, I wonder, just kind of sticking with this period, this Victorian era, whether you might just reflect for a little bit on the phenomenon of dog shows and how this informs this determination to classify and to impose order, and to how this informs the whole idea of dog breeds, please.
Well, dog shows grew out of two different types of event. One were gun trials, in which Victorian gentry competed in shooting competitions, basically trying to, kill game birds. And the other was a tradition that had been established in the 18th century in England of displaying pedigree cattle and pedigree poultry. And these came together in 59, in the town of Newcastle upon Tyne, where the ostensible reason was a display of poultry. But they decided, partly because a person on the board of the committee organizing it was a gun manufacturer called Pape. He was also a dog enthusiast, and he convinced them that as well as having the poultry exhibition, which was the main show, they would have a dog exhibition as well. Just two breeds, English pointers and Irish setters. And all the dogs were male, and all the people showing them were male. At that time, women associated dog shows of any sort were basically dog fights behind pubs, and it was considered unladylike for women to attend those by and large. So to their amazement, they thought they were going to lose money on this, and instead it was a huge success. And within 6 months, more dog shows were being organized, and by the end of the 19th century, there were dog shows virtually every week in Britain and in Ireland. The first one in Ireland was in 1873, which was one of the early dog shows. In America, the first dog show wasn't until about 5 years later.
Right.
But the composition also began to change, because for about the first 10 years, they were mainly frequented by members of the gentry. And there was a strong emphasis on sporting dogs. From quite an early stage, they began to show terriers, for example, and smaller dogs. And so it became more of an urban pursuit. It started off in rural England, and rural Ireland as well, for that matter, but it became more of an urban pursuit. It also began to move rapidly to move out of the kind of ghetto of the gentry and to involve more people, and specifically to involve women. And women at an early stage were able to establish themselves as dog breeders. And it became linked in many cases to the whole idea at a later stage of women's suffrage. So the sense of the expansion that took place changed and turned it effectively into an industry with a regulating body, which was the Kennel Club, which was just called the Kennel Club. It's not called the British Kennel Club, it's just the Kennel Club. Now, until 1922, the Irish Kennel Club was a regional branch of the British Kennel Club. And in fact, the campaign to open or to start off a specifically Irish Kennel Club was tied up with the campaign for political independence. And that's part of the reason that Michael Collins was involved. Yes. In fact, the Irish Kennel Club, its immediate predecessor, was the Irish Blue Terrier Club, that was before they were called Kerry Blues, and which was his favorite dog. And so, it became linked at that time to the campaign for political democracy in Ireland.
Fascinating. Tell me a little bit about the P.T. Barnum of the dog world, Mr. Charles Cruft.
Mr. Cruft, yeah. Well, I mean, he was very similar in many respects to Barnum. he got a job working for a company called Sprat's, and Mr. Spratt had just invented the world's first dog biscuit. And Croft was only 14 when he joined, but he had a very extrovert personality. And when he was 15, he became a traveling salesman for Crofts. And he saw the potential of opening up shows. And when he was 22, he staged his first show. And he staged them over the next 50 years, and they got bigger and bigger and bigger. And you know, he would build them as, you know, the world's biggest dog, the world's smallest dog, the most ferocious dog, very like P.T. Barnum. But they became hugely popular, and he became extremely wealthy. And they were taken over actually by the British Kennel Club in 1948. But his family had continued his, and you know, the Russian Tsars entered dogs, which he was delighted with, and Queen Victoria entered dogs, and King Edward entered dogs. So I mean, he was a natural showman and very similar in technique to Barnum.
I was very amused to discover in your wonderful book that he personally preferred cats.
Yeah, that's right. He tried to have cat shows as well, but they didn't take off, so he had to give up.
Catherine, I wonder, just listening to that, whether there, again, in terms of these parallels with these outsized figures, I'm sort of reminded, for example, of people like Samuel Houghton and these other sort of figures, a man like Lord Roberts of Kandahar, who I think plays a very significant role in the early history of Dublin Zoo. Who are the figures for you who really stand out in terms of you know, the big drivers of the development of the zoo, please?
Well, Philip Crampton, the Surgeon General, would have been the first one, and he's a key man. And then Samuel Houghton, and he was a very interesting character because he was the son of James Houghton, who was one of the people who introduced the penny Sundays. Well, Samuel Houghton had a gold medal from Trinity College. He was an extraordinarily bright man with a lot of interests, and he joined Trinity, the academic staff in Trinity, and became a reverend. But he always had his eye. He kind of took over. He was the second generation in Dublin Zoo, because in any of these voluntary organizations, the founders will have loads of enthusiasm, but they will begin to drop away. And if you don't have a second generation, the zoo will die. And I've seen that with other zoos. But Samuel Houghton was the second generation who drove the zoo. So he would have started really with his influence in about 1860 and continued on till when he died in 1895. And boy, did he have influence. He ran the zoo. He was very funny. He was highly political. He was a rampant home ruler. He used the zoo AGMs to tell Britain to get out of Ireland, in a very colourful sort of way. He organised dog shows in the 1880s in order to raise a bit of money. There was an elephant. The Duke of Edinburgh gave Dublin Zoo an elephant in 1870 because the zoo was always broke. The zoo at that time, it had no money, so it was held together on a wing and a prayer, and then a gift from somebody. Now, Samuel Houghton would have attended every meeting of the council, which was at least once a week, and he would have been out there advising on the health of the animals. He would have been advising on the diet of the animals. So he was really involved, but he had this other side to him as well. And in 1870, Prince Tom, a male elephant, arrived ostensibly to give rides, but a big bull elephant is not necessarily the best elephant to be giving rides. So there were a few issues, and they basically, Samuel Houghton basically told people not to be worrying about it. But in fact, it wasn't possible for Prince Tom to be giving rides. And then two other elephants arrived, Asian elephants who were more docile, and they brought in trainers. But Samuel Houghton would have been all over that, looking after them. And his friends were also on the council. But as his influence waned in the late 1880s, early 90s, a new group came in, and they were quite loyalist in their behavior and the comments they made. And they appointed Lord Roberts, who was the commander-in-chief of the Irish Army, as their president in 98. And when I read that, I was actually quite surprised because he was barely there. In fact, he was one of the best presidents we ever had. The first thing he did was to find out where the public conveniences in the zoo were. And there were very few. And he insisted that these sort of things be put, very practical stuff. He also sent a message around to his officers around the world, Irish officers with the colonial army around the world, to send animals to Dublin, which they did. So we went through a very good phase, but he also employed the first headhunter, if you like, keeper. The first professional animal man was James Kenny. And he had been a rough rider in the 8th Hussars, and he was brought in to look after the big animals in Dublin Zoo, and that was Lord Roberts. So when we go in through the 20th century, the zoo did settle down. It got into a really good pace, and it really wasn't until towards the end of the 20th century when, under Terry Murphy built the zoo up in the 1960s, but it couldn't be sustained. And then Peter Wilson managed to get more land and more money. And then Leo Osterweigel introduced the whole master plan to bring the zoo to where it is today. But certainly those 19th century characters, they were quite something.
Yeah, I want to just stay, if we may, just for a minute back in, I suppose, the 1910s and the 1920s, because there's a kind of a delicate moment in the history of the zoo, isn't it? When after independence, because there is a danger of it losing its way, but the Irish government comes in with a grant, I understand. Is that right?
The zoo was getting a small grant from the 1850s onwards, because they allowed charitable groups in free of charge.
Yeah.
And from the 1890s onwards, it became, after Samuel Houghton retired and his friends retired, the tone became quite loyalist, which I found quite curious. But then again, it's a very interesting period that needs more research. They were during 1916. A lot of the council members were surgeons who worked in the hospitals around Dublin and helped the rebels, some to escape, and they certainly patched them up as well. I mean, quite curious stories. Then we come to 1922, and the council were really concerned that they would lose that little bit of support they had. But there was no need to worry, because the Governor General, Tim Healy, launched something within months of taking over the position. Ernest Bligh and Patrick Hogan, the two government ministers, were members. And it is a phenomenon of zoos that I have seen in my general history of zoos, is they tend not to be political. They tend, because they're animals, because it's the general public, they tend not to come down, and they tend not to be subject to party politics. And the zoo then became known in the 1920s and 30s as a place of peaceful resort, a place that was calm, and the grant was increased. And the only little moment was at this point the Royal Zoological Society of Ireland. And in 1993, when Bertie Ahern said that he would help the zoo out, but he would only do it on condition that the Royal was dropped, which it duly was.
I see. Just to stay on that fascinating observation about the sort of the apolitical nature of institutions such as this, David, I'm very struck about this business of Michael Collins and his Kerry Blue and this society, which, as I understand, is, well, you could argue it's infiltrated by both sides, but it's a very Catholic organization, is it not, with a little c, isn't it?
Yeah, it's curious, and that was one of the reasons that some people objected to me drawing attention to it. That Patrick Kavanagh suggested that particularly Southern Unionists, but Northern Unionists as well, were attracted to dogs because of their lack of political significance. And that they found that by embracing native Irish breeds, they could in some way express their own Irishness without it having a direct political connotation. On the other hand, they were members of clubs such as the Blue Terrier Club, which did identify very strongly as part dog breeding as part of the campaign for Irish independence. And the reason that Collins had such a strong affinity with the Kerry Blue was because it was seen as being racy and of the soil, and you know, even though the Irish Wolfhound had got this mythical status, the reality is, because of its size and needs of food and accommodation, it was only owned really by quite wealthy people, whereas the Kerry Blue was a small dog, relatively easy to groom and feed and look after, and it was seen as being, you know, essentially an Irish dog in a way that the Wolfhound wasn't.
And yet, socially, it was a bit more. It was a bit more complex. And is it Wyndham Quinn?
Yeah,
Wyndham the name of this man who the prize is named after.
He was Lord Dunraven's, one of his sons. Yeah. He was also a member of the same club as Collins during the War of Independence. You know, and they seemed to think that you know, the dogs were somehow exempt from the rules of conflict. And I mean, the British Kennel Club staged dog shows in Ireland until 1921. The last dog show they staged was in Merrion Square in Dublin in 1921, and it coincided with another dog show that was held in conflict with it, which was organised by Collins supporters, and many more people attended it. And it was dominated actually by Kerry Blue Terriers. They were the biggest single breed.
Was it organised in opposition to the other one?
Yeah, it was organised in opposite, but curiously enough, unionist members of the Blue Terrier Club gravitated towards that version rather than the British version. You know, as you say, there were complex loyalties involved at that time, and it wasn't always a black and white situation.
I'm reminded about that in hearing about the two rival shows of the business in, I think it's in 1900 when Victoria comes to Dublin, that she organises, is it a picnic in Phoenix Park, I think? Yeah. And then, is it Maud Gonne organises a rival, the Patriotic Children's Treat, in defiant opposition to Queen Victoria's blatant attempt to bribe the children of Dublin.
Well, I mean, the dog show that was organised by the supporters of political independence survived. The 1921 British Dog Show was the last one. That until then, Irish dog shows had to get a license from the British Kennel Club in order to stage a dog show, but that was the last time that happened. The British Kennel Club is active in Northern Ireland, but there's a lot of overlap between the Irish Kennel Club, and they're not in competition. And in fact, if you go to a dog show, you'll find it's very integrated.
Yes, you make that point. I was encouraged to read that, in fact, in the book. That is it 30% or 30 or nearly 40% of the dogs typically come here, all on an all-island basis. I want to focus now on a particular animal, ladies and gentlemen, arguably the most popular animal in the history of Dublin, and that is Sarah the elephant. And I wonder, Catherine, whether you would tell us a little bit about Sarah the elephant, please.
Yes, she really was so well known. I think people remember Sarah who weren't alive when she died. She's one of those sort of famous animals. She arrived in 1936 as a young Asian elephant from the governor of Madras. And James Kenny, who had been appointed to the zoo in 1898, was the head elephant keeper. But his son, Jimmy Kenny, was a young keeper. And Jimmy Kenny and Sarah struck up a way of being, a very, very good working relationship and Sarah was a very gentle animal. So it's not to be presumed that an elephant will be able to give rides. Elephants are very dangerous animals, and if they don't have the right temperament, they'll cause havoc. But Sarah had a lovely temperament, and within a couple of years, they created a small howdah, which was the chair they put on her back. And they created a small howdah, and they could sit kids on her back, and Jimmy Kenny would take them down a track and around and back. In 1941, when the North Wall was bombed, there was a bomb also in the Phoenix Park near Dublin Zoo. And the next day, when they went out to check how they checked the animals during the night, but the next day they noticed that Sarah had opened her door, gone down to the water. There was no protection around the lake at the time. Had gone into the water, and with her muddy, they could see her muddy footprints going back to her house and back into her place, to her night quarters. She didn't close the door, but she was calm, and so she continued to give rides. And in the 1950s, she was now a full-grown female elephant, so she could take 6 kids on her back, and they created the path down by the lake for her. They put turf mold down to protect her feet, and there were steps on either side, so she would back in between 2 stairs, and the kids would climb up and sit into the howdah. And then if it was a special treat, if it was a birthday or first communion or something, the kid who's having the special treat would be allowed to sit on the front with Mr. Kenny, and go on the walk down the track and back again. And then if it was a really special day, they were allowed to sit on Sarah as she was taken back up the steps to her house. She was also, when we did the second edition of the zoo history, we invited people to send photographs of themselves in the zoo. And then I would contact them if we could use a photograph and get some stories. And most of them were of photographs of people with Sarah the elephant, because she was so docile that you could stand right beside her. She would lift her trunk, lift a leg, and then you could pose with her. And there are so many photographs of people around and underneath almost Sarah having their photograph taken. And then, so she continued giving rides till 1961, but at that stage, zoos, including Dublin Zoo, were saying that this was not necessarily a good idea, not just from a safety point of view, although that was a point of view, but also from, it wasn't really appropriate to the zoos that were, as they were changing. And so she stopped giving rides in 1961, and then she died in 1962. But she'd had a young female Asian elephant who she'd looked after for a number of years, called Cummerly. And Cummerly lived on, but Cummerly, once Sarah went, Cummerly was more difficult to control, and only Jimmy Kenny could really control her. So on a couple of occasions, she got quite out of hand when Jimmy Kenny wasn't around. And she was the one I had a ride on the back of, and it was unofficial. So Jimmy Kenny would sit a child up on her neck and take her for a little walk around the yard. But yeah, so Sarah has definitely lived on, and there was a huge affection for her, and that's what I gathered when I was picking up the stories from people who sent in photographs. There's an enormous affection for Sarah the elephant.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you. And of course, Jimmy Kenny, as everybody knows, was Pat Kenny's father, yeah. And in fact, Pat is among the contributors on a super radio documentary that I think was made by Jimmy Kenny's granddaughter or grandniece. That's available on the RTE website, which I recommend to anybody who is nostalgic or who remembers that era fondly. Because and it's quite clear that a great many people do,
including me, incidentally.
Really?
Sarah, yeah.
And what do you remember about that, David?
Well, I remember every time we went to the zoo, we would head for Sarah. That was the top of our list to see her. And I mean, obviously I was extremely young, so my memories are a little hazy of it, but yeah, no, I did ride on her.
I would urge anybody watching to ask any questions if you wish. I'm very happy to put them to our experts, but I do have one of my own, if I may. Catherine, tell us the truth about the MGM lion. Is there any truth in the rumor that the lion that we see at the start of these MGM films was born in Dublin Zoo or lived in Dublin Zoo or had any connection?
Well, it's very possible. I mean, there are a few layers to this story. It's very possible. Where the rumor started was in 1947, I believe, when MGM came to take photographs of Stephen the lion because they were going to change that. They were thinking of changing the logo. And the director at the time, Cedric Flood, put a notice in the paper to say MGM is going to use Stephen for their logo. But Stephen didn't make the cut. He wasn't used in the long run, and they didn't change the logo in the 1940s after all. But then there was an article written in 1962 which said that Kybra, a 1930s lion, was the MGM lion. And I can find absolutely nothing at all to support this. And I have no idea where the person who wrote that got the information, whether somebody was spinning a yarn. However, we got stuck into it, myself and a film crew, because somebody in America claimed that they had the bones of the first MGM lion from 1919. So this film crew, with encouragement from me and from Dublin Zoo, decided to go and check out the bones, find the bones, check them out, and to arrange for a DNA test between the bones there in America and the bones in the Natural History Museum, with the help of the Natural History Museum, that had come from our lions from that time. I looked right into the history of what was being born, how many lions were being born, and quite an awful lot of lions were born in the early 20s who could have qualified to be the MGM lion called Slats in 1919. Around that time as well, during the war, I think, or around that time, a showman from Hollywood bought some young male lions from Dublin Zoo. So I would say it's within the possibility, the realms of possibility, that the first MGM lion was Slats from Dublin Zoo. When the camera crew went to America to get some ancient DNA from these bones, they discovered that there weren't any bones there. It was just somebody had said they had the bones. So that came to a halt. It was an exciting moment. I did also contact MGM, and I did talk to the senior vice president in charge of that area of the work, and they have no records as to where they might have got the first MGM line. So, I mean, I would say the Dublin lions were so famous. They went around the world. The MGM wanted to use the lions in Quo Vadis, the making of the film Quo Vadis. They weren't used.
To slaughter the Christians. Not likely.
So we had a reputation as suppliers of really good lions. And so it's within the realms of possibility that the first MGM lion was an Irish lion.
Well, I think that's very generous of you, I have to say, not to discount that urban legend entirely. We do have a couple of questions that I just want to put to you folks. You've answered that. The name of the seat that people ride an elephant on, Catherine, is the howdah. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Kate Clark asks, what happened to the zoo dance?
Oh, the dances. They started just after the First World War and took off completely during the Second World War and into the 1950s. And they were so popular that a journalist in the Evening Herald suggested that Dublin Zoo should sell their tickets on the black market because they'd get an awful lot of money for them. And there were fights over getting tickets. And then they began, the 1960s, I've heard some great first-hand stories. I mean, they seem to be terrific. They'd go on to the small hours of the morning. And of course, it was summer. It was, June, it was daylight. All the animals were out and about. The keepers were there, so you could meander around the zoo with your glass of wine and see the animals. And it was all ages. So there was a lot of socializing going on in the monkey house. And I mean, the stories I've heard are very funny. But then they began to peter out, just a shift in, the membership of the society, because more and more families who joined the zoo simply to go there during the weekend, free of, for the price of the annual pass. And those society members were getting older and their young people weren't interested and so on. So they just really petered out. And I think the last one was held in 1980.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Sarah asks, if Dublin was an animal, what would it be? That's a tester. Maybe David, you'd take that on.
Well, we have the highest proportion or ratio of dog ownership in Europe. and the only one that's ahead of us is the United States in the world. So I'm inclined to think that a dog, I mean, around 40% of Irish households have dogs as members, whereas only 20% of British households have. It's reversed in the situation in cats. Cats are much more popular in the UK than they are in Ireland. So I think we're essentially a dog nation.
Right. And if you had to choose a particular dog, and I have a little bit of inside information here because I happen to know that you own a mongrel.
Well, I do, but that was a present I should have. If I had to choose a breed, when I was writing my book about the 9 different native Irish breeds, every time I finished writing about one of the breeds, I thought, that's my favorite. And I honestly thought that with each one, because they each have their own individual characters and their own, factors that make you fall in love with them. But if I were absolutely honest, I would have to say that and it's partly from, my upbringing, was that the dogs that I was closest to and we raised when I was growing up were Irish setters.
Irish setters.
Yeah, and to me, the beauty of the setter, the beautifully balanced frame it has, as well as its character, and of course, each dog has its own individual character, but in broad terms, the breed character is one that I still find very, very engaging.
That's well put. Thank you, Catherine. If Dublin was an animal, what would it be?
I wouldn't know where to begin. Trevor, I really wouldn't know how to answer a question.
Could I suggest an answer?
Yeah, go for it.
He said, blooming cheek, it's one of the privileges of being the host is you can sometimes answer your own questions. To my mind, and it's curious because I've spent the last few months writing about animals, I think if Dublin were forced to choose an animal to be its emblem, I think the natural choice would be an elephant. And I say this for a couple of reasons. Elephants have been displayed in Dublin, as you doubtless know, since the late 18th century. There was an elephant displayed in Parliament Street. Elephants made appearances at Donnybrook Fair before the zoo was established. Elephants were one of the first animals in Dublin Zoo and one of the most popular animals throughout the history of the zoo, as we've heard this evening. And as Lyndall Bates, thank you Lyndall, has just pointed out in the comments, elephants are a ubiquitous presence in the commercial life of our city. They are present in the logos of everything from Elvery's to Camille Thai Takeaway, which is our dear chairman, my boss, his business, the elephant is. They were also in the insignia of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. Elephants, to my mind, in a strange sort of a way, are almost accidentally synonymous with a city in which they have no native presence. So it's a slightly awkward answer, perhaps, but that's my.
Trevor, can I just say something about that? Dublin Zoo keeps their elephants in protected contact now. It's quite complex. If you've been following the Zoo TV program, you'll know that people who will know this. But we were one of the earliest zoos in the world to turn to protected contact, and elephant professionals from all over the world come to see how we do it. So in fact, there could well be something in that, because really we are now known for the way we manage our elephants in Dublin Zoo.
I just want to finish up. I'm going to ask you both one last question, if I may, and it's a slightly awkward question. But I think it's important to address this because a lot of people do have concerns in relation to animals and our general attitude to animals. And I'll start with you, Catherine. Some people say that zoos are just prisons for animals. Are they wrong? And if so, why?
And you were very wise to leave that for a very short, succinct answer, Trevor, because it's a huge question and one that I would have had to look right into. Anybody associated with zoos would have to go into that question. And all I can say is that that zoos are about education, and Dublin Zoo has been from the very beginning. And since 1970, 60% of the world's mammals, reptiles, birds, and fish have been wiped out. And zoos have got a massive reach. 600 million people in the world visit zoos, visit the good zoos, the zoos that are part of the World Zoo Association. So that's a massive body that is available to create a critical mass of informed people to do something about our relationship with the wild. And that's what it comes down to. In Dublin Zoo, with the guidance of the World Zoo strategies, weaves the conservation message into everything that it does. And I remember Kieran McMahon, who's the team leader at the orangutans, went out to see the orangutans in Kalimantan and to work with a conservation program that Dublin Zoo supports in Kalimantan. And there was a male, they were going in to rescue a male orangutan because the palm oil plantations had encroached entirely on its space, and it had less space than there was available in Dublin Zoo. This animal had to live in a space that was smaller in size than Dublin Zoo. And when you're looking at that, you've got to look at the complexity of our relationship with animals. So I would be a supporter of the work that they do. I think it's phenomenal work. And that's my most succinct answer, but it's a huge question.
All right. So we could devote an entire hour to it, indeed. Yeah, thank you. And David, I suppose a similar question for you then. There are people who think that the world would be better off without dog breeds, without pedigree dogs. Are they wrong? And if so, why?
Well, I think there are two aspects to this. I think, first of all, the reality is that dogs would not exist as a species if it weren't for human intervention. So in a sense, every dog, whether a mongrel or crossbreed or pedigree, is a human creation. And if we stopped breeding pedigree dogs, and in fact, if we stopped keeping dogs, perhaps they would evolve back into something approaching a wolf, because their DNA is very, very close, almost identical to a wolf. However, it took around 40,000 years for dogs to evolve. And it would probably take that length of time for them to evolve back, if that's the appropriate term, into something resembling a wolf. The second thing is that, the breeding of pedigree dogs was for purposes. I mean, initially and for hundreds of years, it was not for aesthetic reasons. It was not for moralistic reasons. It was done in order to make effective hunters or rat catchers or, whatever. And the question then is, should we allow pedigree dogs that represent, in many ways, a process that has gone on for thousands of years? Should we let this just lapse, and in the interests of I don't know, some kind of democratic instinct that no animals should be controlled in that way? I think that's naive. I just don't think that has ever happened in human society. And the breeding of pedigree dogs is common to every human society on Earth. It's not a Western thing. Now, against that, there have been instances where cruel practices have been used to breed dogs. And for example, we talked about George Graham earlier. I mean, some of the practices that he used to create the Irish Wolfhound would simply not be accepted nowadays. And the culling of pups, the ruthless culling of pups that occurred in the 19th century, is no longer acceptable. And, occasionally it still happens, but it's illegal. As regards at times it's even been associated, the breeding of pedigree dogs has even been associated with racism. I mean, the breeding of dogs predates any concept of modern racism. It's a product of different types of society.
Mm.
And I think that, you know, having created these creatures, some of them of great beauty, some of them of great skills, and they're still developing those skills. I mean, dogs have lost their jobs in the fields, but they found other jobs, you know. They are used in a lot in medicine nowadays. They can detect epilepsy, they can, and once again, particular breeds of dog have particular aptitudes. Yes. And so while I have, as you say, I don't keep a pedigree dog at the moment, and my affection for a mongrel dog is exactly the same as for a pedigree dog in those terms, but I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
Yeah. Okay, well, again, thank you. It's a hugely complex subject, and one could indeed spend an entire hour on it. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll agree that we've been treated to a fascinating hour listening to two tremendous communicators, two very formidable historians, two hugely passionate champions of the subject, to which they've devoted so much time to becoming experts in. I want to conclude just by urging you, please, if your interest has been stoked in these subjects, please go out and buy these books. They're both available. Catherine, I trust this is available on yours is available on Amazon as well, is it?
I'm not sure. It's available in Dublin in Irish shops, bookshops, and
certainly available in Irish.
Yeah, and at Dublin Zoo.
And I know David's is because I bought it on Amazon the other day. And they're both fantastic books. And it's been such a pleasure to host you this evening on our program. So I just want to finish by thanking you both very, very much.
Thank you
for being so generous with your time. Good evening, everybody. Have a lovely evening, and thank you very much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye now.